So, hello everyone. In this part of a series, we are going to talk on budgetary deficits. This video is going to be a continuation of the past video. So, deficits are the imbalances between expenditure and revenue. If the expenditure is equivalent to the revenue, it is said to be that the budget is balanced. But if the expenditure is more than the revenue, then it is said to be that the budget is under a deficit. And for another condition, if the revenue is greater than the expenditure, then the budget is said to be in surplus. So it is always ideal for us to have more revenue rather than the expenditure. Now there are three kinds of deficits that we are going to talk about: revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, primary deficit. So we are going to talk about each of them. What is revenue deficit? What are the implications? Long run, short run, which is desirable. Alright. Now I got a document which was published by the CAG. It's been a while, but this document and it's very worthy. Although the data points on this document are obsolete, but I will try to update you with the ones that are relevant from today's time. Deficits arise because of imbalances in revenue and expenditure. So these imbalances can be transient, matlab short-lived, or structural. Structural things need a long-run correction. In the context of India, fiscal imbalances have been both large and persistent. Now, in order to keep our fiscal deficits and other things under control, we have set a target under the FRBM Act. Under that, we have a list of things that, okay, we have to maintain our fiscal deficit by 4%, the debt to GDP should be 60%. Now, what are the components of deficit? As I have told you that there are three kinds of deficits: revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, and primary deficit. So, as the word revenue deficit speaks, revenue deficit means revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. Now, hopping on to fiscal deficit. As somebody who has been studying economics for a while, or maybe has started, might have a wrong conception about fiscal deficit that, okay, it must be total expenditure minus total revenue. This is what most people think. But unfortunately, this is not true. Now, what exactly is it then? It is total expenditure minus total net debt receipts. I'll get to it in a couple of minutes. Then, primary deficit is basically fiscal deficit minus the interest payment. So, let's speak on revenue deficit in detail. So, revenue deficit is the excess of expenditure or revenue expenditure over the revenue receipts. So now if the revenue expenditure is more, so as we already know that revenue expenditure is that expenditure which creates new asset. It really doesn't create any new assets, and I told you that revenue expenditures are not very desirable. We need to minimize on them. So it represents the net saving of the government, because revenue deficits lead to increase in borrowings without corresponding to any asset formation. For any doubt, you should just stick to the basic definitions of things. Alright, you should always go back to the basics. Borrowings resorted to meet the revenue deficit do not have any asset backing, and they create an asset liability mismatch. Thus, revenue deficits are generally considered not very desirable. This is the data which is given. It's mostly obsolete. Yeah, this is just one trend that you should keep in mind, that revenue deficit started to rise from 2009 and 8 and onwards. Earlier it was low and then it started rising. As of now, the revenue deficit is 0.8% of the GDP, which is the lowest so far. Okay, these are the data sets from the budget 2025. Revenue deficits, they amounted to around 3.6% post-liberalization period. Now let's come to fiscal deficit. So as I told you that fiscal deficit is total expenditure over its non-debt receipts. Now let's just break it even, okay? Fiscal deficit, what it really means is the total expenditure has two components. One is the revenue expenditure, another is the capital expenditure, okay? Now, this is the component of total expenditure minus total revenue. Now, this total revenue doesn't consist of the debt receipts, okay? Now, what are debt receipts? If you do not remember, get back to basics, that total revenue has two components. One is the revenue receipts and the capital receipts. Okay, revenue receipts have two parts: tax receipts and non-tax receipts. Okay, capital receipts on the other hand also have two kinds. One is debt creating, another is non-debt creating. Okay, so what we really see is we add these components, we do not add this component which creates debt. Now what are these debt creating revenue receipts? Just in case we have to borrow some money from some other institution, bank, organization, or any other country, that may lead to inflow of money, but eventually that's a debt and we will have to repay it, and it's a liability again. Just remember it, that total expenditure over its non-debt receipts. Now these are non-debt receipts. These three are non-debt receipts. Okay, so we just minus them. So fiscal deficit normally represents the net incremental liability of the government. So it basically tells us that how much, apart from the debt that we already have, we need to pay back, the government need to take care of. Alright. Now in case we have a shortfall and our fiscal deficit is really high, so what are the measures that we can take? We can either meet it via another public debt. It may be internal by all these banks, organizations, PSUs, or it can be external by other organizations like IMF, World Bank, other countries. Alright, or we can resort to the surplus fund in the public account. As of now, the fiscal deficit is around 4.8%. This is again from the PIB. Okay, PIB has released it in 2025. Now let's see what is the data that comes up in the budget in a couple of days. The bigger question is, since earlier it was already said that revenue deficits are not generally considered desirable, do you think fiscal deficit is considered desirable? Now that is something to think on again. Fiscal deficit's direction actually depends. Okay, the quality of fiscal deficit makes us answer that question. If the bulk of fiscal deficit is for sustaining capital expenditure or for providing financial accommodation to entities, if we are doing something which leads to capital expenditure and for that purpose we are having a lot of expenses against the revenue that we get with generating, then it's said to be fruitful, right? Because in the long run, lead us create more revenue. So, for providing fiscal accommodation to entities for capital formation, such deficits may be considered desirable. Alright. Now, revenue deficit continues to be a dominant component of the fiscal deficit. Now, let's just write down on the basic things again. Fiscal deficit was total expenditure minus total receipts excluding debt creating receipts. Now, this again we can write as capex plus revenue receipts minus plus revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts plus non-debt capital receipts. Now if we just see this forms revenue deficit. Actually jot down it as capex, like capital expenditure, plus revenue deficit plus non-debt capital receipts. So now it is saying that revenue deficit continues to be a dominant component of fiscal deficit, approximately 69% during 1992 and 2009. As per budget estimates of 2025, it is 39.6% of the fiscal deficit. Okay, revenue deficit is 39.6%. So primary deficit is again fiscal deficit minus the interest payment. So interest payment is that component of revenue expenditure. Okay, and again it doesn't create any asset, it is nothing, we are just paying on the past loans. Okay, interest payments represent the expenditure of past obligations and are independent of the current allocative priorities. So basically primary deficit actually tells us that where our entire money is actually going apart from past obligations calculated out of fiscal deficit. It doesn't include the debt creating receipts. Okay, so it is away from all of these things. Now to keep all of these things under control, the government formulated a FRBM Rules Act 2004. The revenue deficit should be targeted at 0.5% of the GDP. Fiscal deficit to be brought at the level of 3% of the GDP. Now, another thing that has been written at the end of this document is that some factors which may lead to higher revenue deficit and then again indicating towards a higher fiscal deficit is that tax cuts along with expenditure hikes result in a high revenue deficit, because again tax cut means that tax receipts under the revenue receipt part is low, and revenue hike means the capex plus the revex is more. Okay, so that might attribute to a high revenue deficit. Since fiscal deficit has 39% of stakes of the revenue deficit, so if high revenue deficit is there, higher fiscal deficit is going to be there, and that actually leads us to non-compliance of the original targets as envisioned by the FRBM Act. So this is it. I will upload this PDF also in the description below. Until then.